am 77 years old, and I have been trying for the better part of a year to decide whether to say this out loud or simply let it go with me when I go. The business on Carver Street has been there for 54 years. Most people in this town could tell you it was built by Edmund Vance, who ran it well and left it to his son Harlan, who runs it still. They would tell you Edmund was a careful man and a fair one. They would tell you the town was lucky to have him. They're not wrong about any of that. Edmund was careful, and he was fair, and this town was lucky to have him. What they do not know, what no one outside of that marriage has ever known, is that I built it. Every supplier arrangement, every pricing decision, every judgment about what the county needed and what it would pay, and when to extend credit and when to refuse it. 30 years of that. Under his name, with his agreement, and with the world's complete indifference to the actual arrangement. His name was on everything. My hand was in everything. Those are both true, and I have never known what to do with that. What haunts me is not the injustice of how it was structured. I understood the structure before I agreed to it, and I made my peace with it, or I thought I did. What haunts me is the question I have arrived at late, at 77, sitting in the house 2 doors from the store I built, whether a thing you made entirely is truly yours, if the world has always believed it belonged to someone else. I do not know the answer. I'm going to try to find it by saying the whole of it plainly from the beginning, which I have not done before. The town of Carver's Mill sits in a shallow valley in Luzerne County, and in 1853, the year I was born, it had a main street, a courthouse, a Methodist church, a Baptist church, a tannery that smelled in summer, and about 400 souls who all knew one another's business. By the time I was grown, it had added a telegraph office and a second dry goods operation that failed inside 3 years, which is relevant to this account, though I will get to that later. My father was a miller, not the Carver who named the town. That family was 2 generations ahead of us, but a man who leased the grist operation from the Carver heirs and ground flour and cornmeal for the surrounding farms. His name was George Whitfield. He was a precise man, careful with figures, careful with machinery, careful with most things. He taught me to keep accounts when I was 9 years old, because my brother showed no aptitude for it, and my father was not the sort of man to let a skill go untaught, simply because the pupil was a girl. I do not think he considered this a radical act. He needed someone who could tally the weekly receipts and check the miller's share against the weights, and I was the one who could do it. That's the plain truth of it. There was no larger intention on his part. He just needed the numbers to be right. My mother kept the house and raised the 4 of us and made every domestic decision with an efficiency that I did not fully appreciate until I had my own household. She was not a warm woman in the way people mean when they call a woman warm. She did not pet us or read to us much or say tender things, but she managed. Flour, salt pork, wood, lamp oil, winter clothes, summer planting, the laying hens, the doctor's visits, the church obligations. She managed all of it without complaint and without waste, and I understood by the time I was 12 that this was its own kind of intelligence, the kind that keeps a household alive and no one notices because it never fails. I was good at school in the way that was permitted for girls in Carver's Mill in the 1860s, which meant reading and ciphering and some geography and not much else. The schoolmaster, a Mr. Polly, had opinions about what a girl's mind could hold, and he communicated those opinions by assigning the harder problems to the boys and the simpler ones to us. I did the simpler ones quickly and then worked the harder ones in my head while he was occupied elsewhere. This was not defiance exactly. It was just that the problems were there and I could solve them. By the time I was 16, I was keeping the mill's accounts formally, with my father's knowledge and my name in the ledger as the keeper. The ledger was a gray cloth-covered book with Whitfield mill on the front in my father's hand. My entries were in mine. I was not paid for this work. It was understood to be a family contribution, the same as my mother's bread or my brother's labor on the wheel mechanism in spring. I did not object to this. I did not think to object. That was the arrangement, and it was ordinary. Edmund Vance I knew, from church and from the street. He was 4 years older than me and had taught at the county school for 2 years before deciding that he preferred commerce to pedagogy, a preference he stated plainly to anyone who asked. He was lean and dark-haired and had what I would call a considered manner, not slow but not hasty either, the kind of man who finished his sentences and listened when you finished yours. He had been working at Breck's Mercantile, which was the larger of the 2 general stores on Carver Street, learning the trade as a counter assistant. We were married in April of 1875. I was 21, and he was 25, and it was not what anyone would call a romantic courtship. We had spoken at enough church socials to know each other's minds reasonably well, and what we found in those conversations was that we had similar notions of how a life ought to be organized. Edmund wanted his own concern. I wanted something I could not have named precisely at 21, but which I would describe now as the chance to use the full extent of what I was capable of, which was not a thing I had been given many opportunities to do. We did not discuss the particulars of what our arrangement might become until after the wedding. That conversation came later, and it was not the conversation I had expected. The house we moved into was a rented 4-room frame on Birch Street, 2 blocks from the main thoroughfare. Edmund was still at Brecht's then, learning what he could about suppliers and margins and the specific tastes of the county. And I kept the house and helped my mother twice a week at the mill because my father's health had begun to slip that winter. It was in the 3rd month of the marriage that we had the conversation, I mean. Edmund came home one evening in February with a look on him I had not seen before, something between excitement and discomfort, as if he had been turning something over all day and had finally decided to set it on the table. He said, "I have been thinking about the Halstead space." The Halstead space was a vacant storefront on Carver Street, 3 doors from the courthouse, that had held the dry goods operation which failed. The Halstead family had owned it and had left town after the failure, and the building had been standing empty for 8 months, with a for lease notice in the window that everyone walked past and no one took. I said I knew the building. He said, "I think we could run it, a dry goods, full stock, everything from yard goods to hardware, salt and sugar and lamp oil, the things Brecht's carries but without Brecht's prices. There's room in this county for a second concern if it's operated correctly." I said, What does operated correctly mean to you? He looked at me for a moment, and then he said something that surprised me. He said, "It means you running it." I did not say anything for a long time after that. He was not teasing, and he was not flattering me. I knew Edmund well enough by then to know he did not flatter. He laid out what he meant plain and slow, the way he did when he had thought something through to the bottom. He said he knew enough about the dry goods trade from Brecht's to stock a floor and manage a counter, but he had been watching me keep my father's accounts since before we married, and he had seen how I read a balance sheet and how I reasoned about which goods moved and which sat. He said he was good with people and not bad with numbers, but that he was not the one who would see 3 moves ahead in a margin calculation or know when to press a supplier and when to let it lie. I asked him what he thought the arrangement would look like in practice. He said, "You decide. I front it. I sign what needs signing. I stand at the counter when it needs a man's face. I deal with whoever won't deal with a woman. And you tell me what to decide." I asked him if he understood what that would cost me. Not in money, in standing. He said he thought he did. I asked him if he understood what it would cost him, that the credit would be his, but so would the blame, that if it failed, the town would say Edmund Vance could not manage a dry goods store, and that he could never explain why it failed without explaining what the arrangement had been, which would humiliate us both in different ways. He said he had considered that. I sat with it for 3 days. I went over to my mother's and helped her pack salt cod and did not say a word about it. I walked past the Halstead building twice and looked in the window at the empty floor with the dust on it and the marks on the wall where the shelving had been. On the 3rd day, I told Edmund I would do it. I want to be clear about something. I was not coerced. I was not doing it because I had no other choice or because Edmund pressed me. I was doing it because I wanted to build something, and this was the only structure in which building was possible. A married woman in Pennsylvania in 1875 could not sign a lease, could not open a line of credit with a supplier, could not appear before the county clerk on a deed transfer and have the instrument recognized. The law was not ambiguous about this. It was simply the law. Edmund's name had to be on everything. That was not a question. What I decided, sitting in the rented kitchen on Birch Street, was that his name being on everything and my hand being in everything could both be true at once. I had not yet learned what it would cost me to carry both those truths for 30 years. We signed the lease on the Halstead building in March of 1876. Edmund signed it. I sat beside him and did not sign anything. The landlord, a man named Fitch, who held several properties on Carver Street, addressed every sentence to Edmund and looked at me perhaps twice. I was accustomed to this by then, and I did not let it alter my attention. I was noting the terms of the lease, the duration, the repair obligations, the clauses about alterations to the structure, and I had my questions ready. Edmund asked them. I had written them on a slip of paper under the table, and he glanced down at them between each answer. Fitch never noticed. The first account book I bought the following week at the stationer's on Main. A ledger, dark green cloth, 8 inches by 12, with lined pages and a stiff spine. I wrote Vance Dry Goods on the cover in my best hand, and below it the year. Then I opened to the first page and began. I still know where that book is. It's in the bottom drawer of the tall cabinet in the back room of the store. The room Harlan uses for receiving now, but which was my office for 30 years in every practical sense, though it was never called that. The book is there with 11 others, one for each set of years, and every page of every one of them is in my hand. My name is on none of them. The opening inventory took us 3 weeks. I had made a list of what we needed before we signed the lease, based on what I knew about the county, the farms to the north that needed harness hardware and axle grease and heavy duck cloth, the town households that needed muslin and calico and braid, the smaller farms east toward the river that bought salt and sugar in bulk twice a year and could not always get to Brecht's. I'd been watching what Brecht stocked and what it ran short of and what it priced too high. I'd been doing this for 2 years before the conversation with Edmund, not with any clear purpose, just out of habit, the way my mind worked when it was given something to observe. The first supplier contact was a man from Philadelphia who represented a dry goods wholesaler. I will call him the Hartwell man, because that was his firm's name. He came on the train and walked down Carver Street and came into the building where Edmund was installing shelving, and I was on my knees measuring the floor space for the counter layout. The Hartwell man looked at me and then at Edmund. Edmund said, "My wife is handling the ordering." The Hartwell man's face did a small, complicated thing and then arranged itself back into pleasantness. He said, "Very good." He sat down with Edmund at the table we had brought in for exactly this purpose, and Edmund laid out my list and said, "These are our opening requirements." And the Hartwell man looked them over and started to talk, and every third sentence he directed to me, then caught himself, then redirected to Edmund. By the end of the hour, he had stopped redirecting. He talked to me and nodded to Edmund when the nodding was required for appearances. That was how the first supplier arrangement was made. Edmund signed the account agreement. I negotiated every term of it. We got a 30-day payment window and a freight allowance on orders over a certain weight because I had pushed for both, having calculated what they were worth to our cash position in the first 6 months. We opened in May. The first morning I stood behind the counter in a clean apron with the account book open beside the till and watched the first customers come through the door. They came to look mostly that first week to see what the new Vance store had and whether it was worth their trade. I had priced the salt 3 cents below Brecht's and the lamp oil 2 cents below, and the yard goods at parity but in a wider selection. I had done this deliberately, knowing we could not hold those prices past the first season, but that the first season's task was to bring people through the door and let them form the habit. Edmund understood this. He had suggested we price everything at parity from the start to protect the margin, and I had told him why that was wrong, and he had listened and agreed. That was how we worked from the first day. The first year was the hardest kind of hard, not desperate, but grinding. We had enough customers to stay open and not enough margin to feel easy about anything. I kept the accounts every evening after supper, the day's receipts against the day's costs, the running balance, the notes on which goods had moved and which had not. Edmund would sit with me sometimes, and we would go over it together. And those evenings were, I don't want to sentimentalize them, but they were good. We were two people looking at the same numbers and thinking about the same problems, and neither of us was performing anything for the other. By autumn of that first year, I'd identified 3 things that needed to change. The harness hardware was wrong. I had stocked for the northern farms, but not accounted for the fact that they mostly traded with a harness maker 2 towns over, who also carried hardware and gave store credit. I had to reduce the hardware line and shift the space to domestic goods, which had more consistent turnover. I had also underpriced the lamp oil in a way that attracted customers from outside the county who bought in volume and then went elsewhere for everything else, which was not the customer base I wanted. And I had over-ordered on a particular grade of muslin that the county women found coarse. I had judged it by my own hands, which were rough from the millwork, and not by what a woman who sewed her children's good clothes would want to touch. That last mistake I did not repeat. After it, I began paying close attention to what my customers said about texture and weight, not just what they bought. People will buy what is available even when they're not satisfied with it, and the dissatisfaction lives in the remarks they make while buying, not in the transaction itself. A woman who says that will do while she lays down her money is telling you something useful if you're listening. I was listening. Edmund was listening too in his way. He was good at the counter in a manner that I was not, easy with the town's men especially, willing to stand and talk about nothing in particular for 10 minutes before getting to the business at hand. I was less patient with that. I did not see the value in it for the first 2 or 3 years, and then I saw it plainly. Those 10 minutes of nothing in particular were how you learned what the county needed before the county knew it needed it. Edmund brought that intelligence home in the evenings the same way I brought home the account book's intelligence, and together they were more useful than either alone. Harlan was born in 78. There was a girl in 80 who did not survive the first winter. I did not take extended time away from the accounts during either of those years. I'm not certain what this says about me, and I have not spent much time deciding, because it would not change anything to decide. The work was there, and I did it. The arrangement settled into its shape in those early years, and the shape was this. Edmund was Vance Dry Goods to the community. He opened, he closed, he dealt with whoever came in, wanting to deal with the proprietor. He attended the Merchants Association meetings and spoke on behalf of the store. His name was on the lease and the supplier accounts and the advertisement in the county paper that ran twice a year. When credit decisions had to be made formally, when a farm family needed 60 days on a large order and the decision had to be made and recorded, Edmund made it. He signed the note. But before he signed anything, he asked me, always. In 7 years of the arrangement's first phase, Edmund Vance did not make a significant business decision without asking me first, and I cannot think of an instance in which my judgment and his judgment diverged and he overrode mine. This is not a small thing. I want to say it plainly because I have spent time in these late years sorting out what Edmund was, and I do not want to arrive at a version of him that is simpler than the truth. He was not a man playing a role he secretly resented. He was not a man who privately considered himself the real operator and let me believe otherwise. He was a man who knew his own strengths and my strengths and had chosen an arrangement that used both, and he carried his end of it with genuine steadiness for 30 years. That is both the simplest true thing I can say about our partnership and the thing that makes the accounting so difficult. If he had been smaller about it, it would be easier to know how to feel. In the summer of 1882, I tried to acquire the building. Fitch, the landlord, was selling off several of his properties that year. He was in some difficulty I never fully understood, a bad investment in a mining concern somewhere upstate. And he came to Edmund and offered us the Carver Street building at a price that was fair, and that we could meet if we used the savings we had built and took a short-term note from the county bank. I had been thinking about ownership for 2 years by then. A leased space is not the same as a building you own, and I knew by 1882 that the store was going to last, not because I was confident in some general way, but because I had the accounts to show me exactly what it had done in 6 years and what it was likely to do in the next 6. The numbers were clear. We should buy. Edmund agreed. We went to the county clerk's office to begin the deed process, both of us, because I wanted to see whether the clerk would put my name on it. He would not. I do not mean he was rude about it. He was perfectly pleasant, a man named Ord, who I had spoken to a dozen times across the counter of our own store. He explained, in the patient tone of a man explaining something he has explained before, that a married woman's property interest merged with her husband's upon marriage under the laws it then stood, and that the deed would be in Edmund Vance's name, and that this was simply how it was done. I said, "Can her name appear alongside his?" He said, "It can appear, but the legal interest is his. A deed with her name on it does not change that." I said, "Put it on anyway." He looked at Edmund. Edmund said, "Do as she asks. My name is on that deed, Dorothea Vance, wife of Edmund, subordinated and legally meaningless but present. I have the deed in the house. I have looked at it more than I care to count. I do not know whether having my name on a document that gave me no legal standing was a comfort or an insult. Probably it was both. We owned the building after that. I put it in the account book the way I put everything in the account book, in my hand, on the credit side, the full transaction with the date and the note number and the terms. The account book does not know the name on the deed was not solely mine. It records what I decided. That is all it has ever done. By the mid-1880s, the store was the better of the 2 dry goods operations in the county. Brecht's was larger in floor space, but Brecht himself was aging and his sons had different interests, and by 1887 they had reduced the stock and stopped expanding the lines. I'd been watching this happen for 3 years, and I had been preparing for it. Building the supplier relationships, extending the selection in yard goods and in the domestic hardware line, adding a small millinery section in the back corner that drew women who might otherwise go to Cora Belsham's shop on the next block. Cora Belsham noticed this. She was a capable woman who ran her millinery alone, her husband having left the county under circumstances no one discussed directly, and she had a shrewd eye for what was happening around her. She came into the store one afternoon and looked at the hat forms in the back corner, and then came to the counter where I was standing and said, without preamble, "That is not a millinery. That is a threat." I said, "It's 6 hat forms and some ribbon." She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "I know who runs this store, Dora Vance." I did not say anything. She said, "I always have." She picked up a spool of ribbon and looked at the price and set it back down. She said, "6 hat forms is enough," and she left. She never said it again, and I never said it to her. But we understood each other after that, and I kept the millinery section to 6 forms for the rest of the time she was in business, which was another 12 years. The mature years, I will call them that, the years from roughly 1888 to Edmund's death in 1921, had a rhythm to them that I can describe now as steady, without meaning that nothing happened. Things happened. What I mean is that the fundamental nature of the arrangement had settled, and we had both accepted it, and were working inside it, and the day-to-day texture of the work was the texture of a going concern rather than a new one. I made the ordering decisions. I managed the supplier relationships. The Hartwell man came twice a year until he retired and was replaced by a younger man from the same firm who had to be trained all over again in who to address, which took about 1 visit. I set the credit terms for farm accounts. When the county had a bad harvest year, which happened twice in the 90s, I made the decision to carry the affected accounts through the winter and take the notes at lower interest than the bank would have required, because I had calculated that a customer who was treated decently in a hard year was worth more over the following decade than the interest differential I was foregoing. And because I had been watching farm families borrow from sources that were not decent, and I did not want to be one of those sources. Edmund delivered these decisions to the customers. He sat across the counter from a man who could not make his November payment, and he said, "We'll carry you through to spring planting, Amos, and settle it then." And Amos looked at Edmund Vance and felt that Edmund Vance was a fair man. He was. That is not wrong. Edmund sitting across from Amos and saying those words meant that Amos believed them, and Edmund's steadiness made them true in the moment of saying. What I supplied was the calculation behind the words. What Edmund supplied was the face and the voice and the human weight of a man the other man trusted. Both of those things were necessary. I've never doubted that. What I doubted in those years was smaller than that. It was something I noticed at the County Merchants Association dinner in 1893, which I attended as Edmund's wife. There was a speaker from Harrisburg who talked about the credit practices of rural dry goods operations in Pennsylvania, their role in carrying farm families through difficult seasons, their function as the financial spine of counties that lacked sufficient banking. He spoke well and accurately. He mentioned several operations by name as examples of good practice. He mentioned Vance Dry Goods of Carver's Mill. He said, "Edmund Vance has demonstrated how a proprietor with sound judgment and genuine concern for his community can run an operation that benefits everyone who depends on it." I sat at the table and listened to this, and I ate my dinner. Edmund, beside me, did not look at me. We had been married 18 years, and he knew better than to look at me in that moment. Later, in the carriage going home, he said, "I am sorry, Dora." I said, "There is nothing to be sorry for. He believed what he said. He has no reason not to." Edmund said, That does not make it right." I said, "No, but it is not something that can be corrected at a dinner table, and we both know it." He put his hand over mine in the dark of the carriage, and I let him keep it there. That was all that was said. I came home and opened the account book to the current week's entries, my hand on every page, my name on none. There were moments when the arrangement nearly became visible. I will describe two of them because they are the clearest. The first was in 1895. A dispute with a farm supplier, a man named Goss who ran a local feed and grain and had been selling us oats and cornmeal for 8 years, turned sharply one autumn over a short weight delivery. I had caught the discrepancy in the accounts and had written out the full documentation of it. 3 deliveries, each underweight by a similar margin, with the dates and the amounts paid and the amounts owed as I calculated them. Edmund took this documentation to Goss and presented it. Goss refused to acknowledge the discrepancy. He said the weights were correct and the error was in our measurement, and he said this in a tone that made clear he considered it closed. Edmund came back and told me what had been said, and I told Edmund to file the claim with the county weighmaster. Edmund did. The weighmaster found in our favor. Goss paid the difference and discontinued doing business with us. What happened after was the part I mean. Goss told people that Edmund Vance had disputed his weights and won, and people told other people, and by the following spring it was a known thing in the county that Edmund Vance did not let a short measure pass. This reputation had value. It brought us accounts from farmers who had been doing business with Goss and did not like his methods. None of this was incorrect. Edmund had disputed the weights, in the sense that he was the one who had gone to Goss and to the weighmaster. But the preparation of the documentation, the decision to pursue the claim rather than absorb the loss, the calculation that the reputation benefit outweighed the cost of the dispute, all of that was mine. What the county knew was Edmund's name on a reputation I had built. This was ordinary. This was how it always was. What made it noticeable to me was that I had just spent 3 weeks on the documentation, and it was some of the clearest work I had ever done, and it existed in one place, in my hand, in the account book, and not in anyone's knowledge of me. The second moment was in 1901. I had been ill that spring, a chest ailment that kept me from the store for 6 weeks, the longest I had been away in 25 years. Edmund ran the store alone. He did it adequately. He kept the counter and handled the customers and made the necessary daily decisions himself. And when I came back, the business was intact and no serious errors had been made. But I could see in the accounts where the decisions had been different from what I would have made. A supplier offer that should have been accepted had been declined. A credit extension that should have been refused had been granted. None of these were ruinous. They were the decisions of a capable man who did not have my particular knowledge of the operation's specific mathematics. I corrected what could be corrected and let the rest go. Edmund and I did not discuss it much. I think we were both aware of what those 6 weeks had demonstrated about where the real weight of the operation actually sat, and we did not need to say it aloud. What I thought and did not say was this: the store survived my absence. It would not have survived his, because I would have had no authority to act. A supplier who needed a signed decision, a bank that required the proprietor's presence. Those things would have stopped the store in ways that my illness had not. Edmund's name was the only name the world recognized, and if Edmund had been the one ill, the name on the account book would still have been his, and the decisions would still have had to wait for him to be well enough to sign them. I had built something that could not function without me except as a going concern, and could not function at all without a man's name that was not mine. Those two things were both true, and they lived side by side in the account book and always had. Edmund's health began failing in 1917. He was 68 and had worked the counter for 40 years, and his joints had gone bad and his wind was short. And by the winter of 1918, he was coming to the store only in the mornings, and by the following spring only when he felt equal to it. Harlan had been in the business by then for 15 years. He had come in at 22 and had learned it the way young men learn things from their fathers, watching, asking, assuming that what he was watching was the full account of how it was done. I had taught him what I could in the spaces available to me. I had explained order and logic and supplier negotiation and how to read a slow-moving inventory. I had done this as Edmund's wife who helped with the books, which was how everyone in the store and in the town understood my role. Harlan is not a stupid man. He is a decent man and a competent one, and I say this without reservation. But he had grown up understanding that his father ran the store and his mother helped, and that is what he saw because that is what was shown to him. I do not blame him for this. The arrangement required that he see it that way, and we maintained it with enough consistency that he never had reason to look closer. There were things he could not account for, that I noticed him not accounting for. He could not explain, for instance, why certain supplier terms were as favorable as they were, because the negotiations that had secured them had been conducted between me and the supplier's representatives over years of relationship, with Edmund present but not primary. Harlan assumed his father had been skillful in negotiations. He was not wrong that Edmund had been present. He was wrong about who had done the skill. I could have told him. In those last years when Edmund was declining and the store was passing to Harlan, in fact, if not yet in name, I could have sat with my son and said, "Here's the account book. Here's my hand on every page. Here's what I actually did and how I did it." It would have been the truth. I did not do it. I have spent considerable time in the years since asking myself why, and I think the answer is several things at once. Partly it was loyalty to Edmund, not loyalty to the fiction that he had built it, but loyalty to the man himself, to the arrangement we had made together, to the years of evenings we had spent with the accounts and the quiet understanding between us. To tell Harlan would have been to alter what Edmund had been in his son's knowledge, and I was not willing to do that while Edmund was still living. But partly, and I'm trying to be honest here, more honest than is comfortable, partly I did not tell him because I did not know how. Not how to find the words, but how to say them, and have them received as true. I had spent 40 years as Edmund's wife who helped with the books, and I was not certain that Harlan, having understood me in that role for his whole life, could receive a different account of it and believe it without strain. I was afraid of not being believed, not by strangers, by my son. That fear was not something I had anticipated, and I found it shaming. so I said nothing. And Edmund died in June of 1921, and the newspaper ran a notice that said he had built Vance Dry Goods into one of the finest operations in Luzerne County over 45 years. A careful and community-minded merchant whose name would be remembered in the county for a generation. I read that notice at the kitchen table, and then I folded the paper and put it with the others. Edmund's funeral was in late June, warm, the church full. People came from 3 counties who had done business with the store. There were remarks from the pastor and from the head of the Merchants Association and from a man who had known Edmund from the school-teaching days before the store. Each of them spoke about Edmund the merchant, his fairness, his patience with farm accounts, his eye for what the county needed. The man from the Merchants Association said, "He built this store from an empty floor and a borrowed idea, and he built it with nothing but the strength of his own judgment and his care for this community." I sat in the front pew with Harlan on one side and Harlan's wife on the other, and I listened to all of it. The church was hot. I had my good black dress on and my hands in my lap. The pastor said to me afterward, pressing my hands in both of his, "He was a good man, Dorothea, a truly good man. You must be proud of what he built." I said, "I am." This was not a lie, and it was not the truth. It was the only thing I could say that was not one or the other. In the months after the funeral, I continued to come to the store. Harlan did not ask me to stop, and I did not stop. I had no formal role. The store was Harlan's now. The accounts were his responsibility. But I came in the mornings and sat in the back room and looked at the ledgers and occasionally made a note. Harlan let me do this with the same patient tolerance a son shows an aging parent who cannot quite let go, and I accepted his tolerance because the alternative was not coming, and I was not ready for that. What I was not able to say to him, and what I said to no one, was that I was not lingering out of sentiment. I was looking at the accounts the way a person looks at something they built to see if it is still standing right. The store was standing right. Harlan was making sound decisions and the margins were holding. He had learned more than I had given him credit for. By the second year after Edmund's death, I had stopped going in most mornings. The store did not need me in the way it had needed me, and I understood that it did not. And I was honest enough about myself to know that it was harder to walk in and look at a ledger in someone else's hand after looking at one in my own hand for 30 years. The account books were still there, 12 of them in the cabinet, my hand on every page. The entries were in the same hand from 1876 to 1919, when my right hand began to cramp badly enough that I had started keeping the current entries in a different form, briefer, and Harlan had begun keeping the full ledger himself. 12 books, 43 years of decisions in my hand, under Edmund's name. I did not take them when I stopped going in. They belong to the store as much as the shelving does. But I knew where they were, and I still know where they are. And I think about them more than I think about most things. The question arrived slowly. I do not mean I had not thought about it before. I had, in the ways a busy person thinks about hard things, sideways and briefly, and then put aside because there was always something specific that needed doing. But after Edmund died and I was no longer doing the daily work of the store, the question had space to sit, and I could not keep sidestepping it. The question is this: Did I build it? I know what the answer looks like from the account book. Every order and decision, every credit term, every adjustment to the stock, every supplier negotiation, they're in there, in my hand, dated and detailed. The record is complete and unambiguous. If you read the account book from 1876 to 1919, you would know exactly who made the decisions that built Vance Dry Goods into what it became. But the account book does not say my name. It says Vance Dry Goods at the top, and the dates and the entries, and that is all. It does not say Dorothea Vance made these decisions. It does not say she chose the suppliers and set the terms and managed the credit and watched the inventory and knew the county's needs 3 seasons ahead. It says the decisions, not the decider, because that was the only record I was in a position to keep. And beyond the account book, the building stands in Edmund's name. The supplier accounts were in Edmund's name. The banknotes were in Edmund's name. The reputation of the store, for fairness, for sound credit practice, for understanding what the county needed, that reputation attaches to Edmund Vance in the knowledge of everyone who dealt with it, because Edmund was the face and the name and the signature of the operation. He was also, in genuine ways, part of what made it work. I want to be careful about this. A store is not only its accounts, it is also the feeling people have when they walk in and the trust they extend when they ask for credit. And Edmund built that feeling and deserved that trust. So what was mine? The answer I've arrived at, after 9 years of widowhood and sitting in a house 2 doors from the store, is that the question is not quite right. The question I kept asking, whether it was mine, assumes that building a thing and owning a thing are the same, or that credit and truth are the same, or that a name on a record and a hand in a record come to the same weight over time. They do not. I have known that for 50 years. What I have been slower to understand is that knowing the difference does not tell you how to live with it. Edmund is dead. Harlan runs the store and does not know the full story. The account books are in the cabinet and no one has opened them in years except to check a historical figure. My name is on none of them, and the people of Carver's Mill drive past the store and see the sign that says Vance and Sons and think of Edmund Vance, who built it. I'm 77 years old and I live 2 doors away, and I have told this to no one until now. I have been thinking about whether to tell Harlan, not about the arrangement in all its specifics, not to overturn what he has understood about his father, which I am not certain he could receive cleanly at this point in his life, and which would not, in any case, alter what Edmund actually was. Edmund was a good man and a genuine partner, and he ran that counter for 40 years, and the community's regard for him was not unearned. That is true. It will stay true. But I've been thinking about whether to tell Harlan that the account books are mine in the sense, I mean, that the hand in them is mine, and the decisions behind the hand are mine, and that if he ever needs to understand how the store was built and why it worked, he should read them and know who kept them, not to correct what he thinks about his father, just to know the truth of what I did. I have not told him yet. I may not tell him. I am trying to decide whether the telling would be for his benefit or mine, and I have not settled it. What I know is that there is one thing I want to say plainly here, to whatever record this becomes. I built it. I built Vance Dry Goods from an empty floor in a building that smelled of the previous tenant's failure. I chose the stock and set the prices and managed the suppliers and extended the credit and watched the margins and knew the county's needs better than anyone in the county knew them, because I had been watching and calculating for 30 years while people addressed their remarks to the man beside me. I did this inside an arrangement that required his name and his presence and his willingness, and I am not diminishing those things. His name made the transactions possible. His face at the counter made the trust possible. His patience with the arrangement, and it was real patience, not resignation, made the partnership possible. I could not have done it without him, but he could not have done it without me either, and the county does not know that, and the newspaper did not say it, and the Merchants Association man did not say it at the funeral, and it has not been said in 54 years of the store's operation. I am saying it now. I am the only one here, and there is no one to address it to, and it will not change the sign on the building or the name on the deed, or what Harlan believes about who built the life he inherited. But I am saying it. His name was on everything. My hand was in everything. Those are both true, and I have never known what to do with that. I'm 77 years old, and I think, at 77, the only thing to do with it is to say it. Last Tuesday, I walked to the store, not to go in. I did not go in. I stood on the street in front of the window and looked at the display Harlan had arranged, bolts of cloth and a set of good work boots and a card advertising the spring prices on seed goods. It was a decent display. He has better instincts for it than Edmund had, if less patience for the accounting side. The sign above the door says Vance and Sons in painted letters, black on white, and below it the year the store was established, 1876. That is the year I walked into the Halstead building with Edmund and knelt on the floor and measured the counter space and wrote the first entry in a green ledger. I stood on the street and looked at 1876 in black paint for a while, and then I went home. I have thought since then about the account book, the first one. It's in the bottom of that cabinet under 11 others. 54 years old, the spine's still solid because I used good boards and a good binding. My hand is on every page. The entries begin in March of 1876 and run through to the end of the first year, and they are complete and accurate, and they record exactly what was decided and when and why in the plain language I used for those entries, not explaining, just stating, because a ledger does not need to explain itself, only to be accurate. My name is not in it, not on the cover, not on the title page, not in any entry. There is no signature that says I made these decisions. There is only the hand which is mine, which anyone who had seen my hand enough times would know as mine, which Cora Belsham would have known, and which the Hartwell man would have known by the end of his first visit, and which Edmund always knew, and which Harlan does not know, because he has never had reason to compare the account books to anything his mother wrote. I have thought about what to do with the books. I could leave them as they are and let Harlan keep them in the cabinet until the store is sold or demolished, whenever that is, and let them be what they are, old ledgers from a dry goods store in Luzerne County, interesting to no one, written in an unidentified hand. That's the most likely outcome, and I have made what peace I can with it. I could write my name in them, on the front page of each one, in the space where a name might go. Dorothea Whitfield Vance, 1876. That would be simple. I have thought about it more than once. What stops me is not that it would be dishonest. It would be honest. It would be the most honest thing I could do, but that it would change nothing that matters. The store's name would still be Vance and Sons. The deed would still show Edmund's name. The newspaper notice would still say what it said. Writing my name in a ledger that sits in a cabinet in a back room does not constitute being known. What I have settled on is this. I built it. I know I built it. Edmund knew I built it. Cora Belsham knew it. The Hartwell man knew it, in the particular way that a supplier knows which voice to listen for when the important questions get asked. These are small knowings, partial knowings, not the kind of knowing that goes into the public record or the newspaper or the history of Luzerne County's commercial development. I do not have a clean verdict on whether that is sufficient. I have looked for one across 9 years of widowhood, and it has not come, and I do not think it will come. I do not think the question is the kind that resolves. A thing you build is yours in the way you build it, which is in the doing of it, and you are the only one who has been in every room of that doing. Other people's knowledge of it is a different thing from the thing itself. I have known that for 50 years, and I did not always find it enough, and I find it a little more enough now that I am 77 and have less time for what is not enough. His name was on everything. My hand was in everything. Those are both true. I am not certain I know what to do with that even now, but I have said it. The account books are in the cabinet on Carver Street, and my hand is on every page of every one of them. And I have finally said it, and that is what I have.